Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for a small, new, short series on the general elections 2024. We thought it'd be useful to look at some questions around elections from a more theoretical Marxist point of view. For example, we'll be looking at the Labour Party next week. Should we still vote for it? Maybe some candidates deserve our vote, maybe others. Should we put conditions forward? Should we put forward demands they should support, etc.? We'll also have a debate, hopefully, between some candidates from different organizations. Unfortunately, we've only had Chris Williamson and Communist Future from Manchester confirmed. We're still waiting for Tusk to even reply, as well as Andrew Feinstein and a few other individuals standing. So if anybody has any particular good connections to any candidates that are standing for Tusk, for example, or as independents, please let us know. It'd be good to have a good discussion, good debate online. So tonight, we're starting with a look at Marx, Engels, and the Chartists and their attitude to elections, which was, as often the case in Marx and Engels, characterized by certain tactical flexibility. In different circumstances, they argued for different things. So there's no blueprint that works for every situation, every country, every historical situation. So that's a really useful thing to look at. Ian, over to you.
Good evening, comrades. Yes, it's been quite a pleasure to go back to some of the early stuff written by Marx and Engels about the Chartists. Of course, the Chartists were not just a single group of people. They were not a completely homogenous political party. But they were really the first kind of proletarian party that Marx and Engels studied closely, because, of course, Engels himself was in Manchester in 1842 and became closely acquainted with the Chartists and contributed actively to their newspapers, both the Northern Star and later the Red Republic. Certainly in terms of their support for the Chartists' program, you can see a fulsome support by Marx and Engels for the idea of standing candidates in parliamentary elections. This is, of course, in stark contrast with people like Mikhail Bakunin in the First International and Pyotr Kropotkin and other anarchists such as Proudhon, who generally opposed the idea of being involved in political struggles, that is to say, struggles for places in Parliament or wherever else, in favour of either insurrection or in favour of what we might call economistic struggles in the workplace through trade unions and that kind of thing. What we see, of course, with Marx and Engels is that they were prepared to embrace all of those things. And what they didn't do is engage in, for example, adventuristic insurrection, and advised always against insurrection unless it had a fair chance of success. What we'll see with the Chartists, of course, is that it too encompassed a range of different perspectives and with more or less success before it eventually was surpassed by other forms of organization. So without further ado, a nice little picture of a Chartist riot here. At different times, as I say, as we'll see, insurrection broke out rather than was consciously planned by Chartists. The People's Charter of 1838 was really put together by some radical MPs who were already in Parliament. And here the context of radical often meant liberal, bourgeois, and in favour of free trade. What we see with the Chartists is quite often an alliance between radical MPs, free trade liberals, people who would later go on to form Whig Party or Liberal Party tendencies, and in alliance with left-wing Chartists who were above all opposed to the aristocracy. Um, the Great Reform Act of 1838, if anybody is in Newcastle upon Tyne at any point, please make your way to the monument. And the monument is to Charles II Earl Grey, who was the Whig Prime Minister in 1838. He played a prominent role in the Great Reform Act. Now, the Great Reform Act extended the franchise further than it had ever been extended, but it still remained a property qualification franchise. So men with property and an income above a certain level, only they could vote. He did make other prominent reforms, such as an end to slavery in the British Empire and steps towards Catholic emancipation. So you'll see a huge monument to Charles Earl Grey in the middle of Newcastle. But it has to be remembered that for much of the working class, the Great Reform Act of 1838 was a betrayal. It was a sellout of what became later the Chartists' principal requirement was for universal male suffrage over 21. Naturally, today we wouldn't consider that being a particularly progressive. We would want universal suffrage. And I'm pleased to see that at long last, the Labour Party is committed to universal suffrage from the age of 16. Whether they keep their word or not remains to be seen, of course. So in response to the Great Reform Act, demand for universal male suffrage over the age of 21 in a secret ballot with no property qualifications for standing as an MP and payment for MPs, because after all, prior to this, I mean, someone like Charles Earl Grey becoming Prime Minister was Prime Minister from the House of Lords. He was the second Earl Grey. He was there by birthright. And moreover, in order to become an elector, in order to be even have a vote, you had to have a certain amount of property, a certain amount of income before you could even vote. There were, up until 1872, really two types of election, in a sense. There were the hustings, which you often hear referred to, and sometimes it's referred to in the context of contemporary politics. We talk about the hustings as being, these kind of debates on telly or whatever else, or debates in local town halls or something like that. In practice, that's just a sort of a mirror image of what used to exist, a kind of a pale shadow of what used to exist. At one time, a popular vote would be held in a constituency where a show of hands would be held. And in principle, one could be elected by popular acclaim in that way. In practice, of course, what used to happen was whatever the show of hands showed, the real poll, but only by electors, would actually count for anything and gain a seat in Parliament. So no property qualifications for MPs, the payment of MPs so that ordinary working people could stand, equal constituencies of equal size. I mean, it has to be remembered that at the time of the early period of the Chartist movement, Manchester, a vast and growing city, returned no members of Parliament. By contrast, Newport and the Isle of Wight returned two and had a constituency in double figures. 10 or 11 people were voting for two members of Parliament. These archetypal rotten boroughs were the basis, therefore, of the continued influence, in particular, of landed gentry, even in the House of Commons, despite the fact they already also had, of course, the House of Lords. So equal constituencies were a key demand, and the only one that's not been successfully gained has been annual parliamentary elections. Now, the whole idea of annual parliamentary elections, I mean, a tendency is on the part of at least some people to think, well, goodness, that wouldn't even get time to get settled in. But that's just the point. It was put forward as an argument for this is something that will stop corruption, stop and give the electorate an opportunity to kick out their member of parliament if they're not doing their job properly. And so the parliament had to respond to the popular will, rather than just being given a sinecure for 4 or 5 years to sit about in the House of Commons and vote how the hell you like. This was an early demand for the recall of members of Parliament, and not only when they've been caught doing some minor or major criminal activity or sexual misdemeanor. So the Chartists were putting forward a series of radical demands, radical in a dual sense, really. Radical in the sense that it was also allied with the liberal bourgeoisie and against the aristocracy, but also because this was one of the first real mass proletarian movements. It had a proletarian character from the outset, and had a significant impact. Interestingly, during the course of the research to prepare for this, I had cause to plough through parts of volume 6 of Marx and Engels' collected works, and found things that I'd never read before, which is one of the joys of preparing these things. One of them, the first essay in volume 6, is the Festival of Nations in London. In 1845, there was a Congress called in London to celebrate the Great French Revolution of 1789, and it was addressed by workers. Over 1,000 people were present, celebrating the Great French Revolution. A large number of German workers were there. London at the time had lots of German workers who were migrants or refugees from political persecution in London, but there were many French workers, and it's a nice essay to read by Engels, who is a great writer in his own right, but he also includes great tracts from the Chartist Harney, for example, and others. So he includes great long pieces of other people's speeches as a means of publicizing, and these were often then published in the Northern Star, which was the Chartists' journal. And I hadn't realized until I'd started to research this just how widely read the Northern Star was in mainland Europe. French and German radicals looked to the Northern Star as one of the best journals that could be read on the radical left, not least of which because Marx and Engels were writing for it. But in 1845, the Fraternal Democrats, an association of left Chartists, and the League of the Just, if you recall some of our earlier sessions when we were talking about the development of the Communist Manifesto, the Communist League was an amalgamation, as it were, of the League of the Just and the Communist Correspondence Committee to form the Communist League. And the Fraternal Democrats were made up of left Chartists and the League of the Just, who then subsequently joined the Communist League. And Engels' little essay, Festival of Nations in London, is in Marx and Engels' Collected Works, Volume 6. Unfortunately, it's difficult to get on the Marx Engels Internet Archive because of the copyright problems with Lawrence and Wishart, but it is available on some other sites. And the other useful essay, and a very interesting little essay by Engels again, is by the Brussels Communist Correspondence Committee. And it's an address of the German Democratic Communists of Brussels to Mr. Fergus O'Connor, published in the Northern Star on the 25th of July in 1846. And again, this is in volume 6 of the collected works. It's just a short piece, pages 58 to 60. In it, really, the Brussels Communist Correspondence Committee is writing to the Northern Star to congratulate Mr. Fergus O'Connor on his election. We'll come on to Fergus O'Connor as a leading figure within the Chartist movement in a little while, although Fergus O'Connor himself didn't regard himself as a communist. He was generally opposed to the idea of what he saw as the state ownership of land, and instead proposed kind of cooperatives, as it were, and the sort of Chartist associations owning land. The idea is that it was still a very much a land-based program that O'Connor was putting forward personally, um, which saw land being parceled out to workers rather than the proletariat taking power in any way, shape, or form. But nevertheless, the address of the German Democratic Communists of Brussels to Mr. Fergus O'Connor is a fulsome appreciation of Fergus O'Connor's achievement in being elected as the only Chartist MP when he was elected for Nottingham, and in so doing, by the way, defeated Thomas Hobhouse, who was one of the principal protagonists of free trade in the House of Commons at the time. It's easy to see why Marx and Engels and the Chartists were so closely associated. Engels first moved to Manchester in 1842. As you'll know, he lived with his pretty much lifelong partner, Mary Burns, or partner for decades anyway, until her sad death. And it was Mary Burns, for example, who showed Engels around the dingiest, poorest parts of Manchester. The poorest of the poor were often the Irish in Manchester. And it was much of that evidence, and it was much of that research that found its way into the condition of the working class in England, published in 1845. And it was Engels' writings on the condition of the working class in England which so impressed Marx when they subsequently met for a second time in Paris in 1844. Engels took part, of course, in the revolutions of 1848, as is well known, as the aide-de-camp to Auguste Willich, who was commanding a Freikorps in the revolutionary forces at the time. Engels escaped back to England, to London in November 1849, and then to Manchester to take up the day job, as it were, managing the family firm, and using the money, whether pilfered from the petty cash, which he was known to do, to pass on to Marx to help support him, or whether just sending him a regular subvention in order to keep Marx in his studies. So Marx took refuge in London in 1849, and they both wrote for the Northern Star. And I hadn't realised just how, until I started preparing this, just how much impact the Northern Star had on the European working class as well. Until this. This is George Julian Harney. It's an interesting kind of relationship that Marx and Engels have with Harney and others within the Chartist movement. On the one hand, they could be privately scathing about people they worked closely with. They could be very, very critical, both privately and publicly, about people they worked with. George Harney played an enormous role within the Chartist movement. He was originally a boy merchant seaman who had served 3 prison sentences before the age of 19. But he was present at the first convention of the Chartists in 1839. What followed in 1839, given the absolute outrage that many workers felt at the great reform of 1838 and its failure to extend the franchise to workers. One of the outcomes of that was a series of petitions. And the petition in protest against the Great Reform Act of 1838 had something like 1,250,000 signatures on it. And Parliament refused to accept it. What then happened was, yeah, I mean, when you consider the petitions that you see endlessly circulating on the internet, and they get a few hundred here or there, this is a petition with over 1 million signatures that would have been handwritten and circulated from person to person, and then duly delivered on paper to the House of Commons. So George Harney was editor of the Northern Star, a paper which was founded in 1837, I think, by Fergus O'Connor. And um, Harney was a member of the League of the Just and subsequently of the Communist League. So remember that kind of interesting kind of connection that existed between um, the Fraternal Democrats, which was the left of the Chartists, which would have been someone like Harney, and then so he was a member of the Communist League. And he knew Frederick Engels from 1843 because Engels had been in Manchester from 1842, and one of the first things he did as part of his research into the condition of the working class in England was seek out George Harney because he was well known. Again, George Harney on the left in Britain at least would have been far better known than Frederick Engels in his day. Um, Harney, of course, subsequently met Marx in 1847 and formed the socialist newspaper Red Republican. And it was the Red Republican which in 1850 published the first ever English translation of the Manifesto of the Communist Party. If you look at Hal Draper's book, The Adventures of the Communist Manifesto, the first English translation wasn't particularly good, apparently, but nevertheless, it served a useful purpose at the time and was very approvingly reprinted over 4 issues of the Northern Star by George Harney. So whatever else George Harney did, he did a great deal to publicize the works of Marx and Engels, particularly to an English-speaking audience. This is Ernest Charles Jones, who was also a very important figure on the left of the Chartist movement. And he was born in Berlin to really an aristocratic family. Apparently, he was born in Berlin because his family were visiting the Prussian court at the time. His father was a major in the British Army and was aide-de-camp to the Duke of Cumberland, who subsequently became King of Hanover. So you can see the kind of circles that Ernest Charles Jones's parents moved in. But Ernest Jones was radicalized fairly early on and became a Chartist and was imprisoned for 2 years for sedition. I mean, among other things, for calling for Irish independence. And it's an interesting feature of the Chartist movement, and it's an interesting feature of Marx and Engels' appreciation of the Chartist movement was that proletarian internationalism was at the very heart of it from the outset, and the appreciation, for example, of the importance of the French Revolution that was being celebrated and written about by Engels was an appreciation of the international solidarity of workers and an appreciation also of the position of Ireland within the context of Britain. And so many of the documents within Chartism were also bound up with an appreciation of the role played by Britain in Ireland, in particular the fact that Ireland had lost its parliament after the uprising of 1798. And indeed, Fergus O'Connor, his uncle, had in fact been part of the United Irishmen uprising and one of the United Irishmen. So Ernest Jones was a supporter of Irish and Indian independence. There is an argument which says that Marx tended to regard the imperial spread, as it were, the empires themselves, as not necessarily being reactionary of actually helping to develop the productive forces. It is, some have written that Ernest Jones was one of the people that convinced him, in fact, that British imperialism was actually impeding the development, for example, of Ireland and India and so on. I don't think actually Marx needed a great deal of persuasion to that. But what's important here is that Ernest Jones helped found Another Chartist newspaper, Notes to the People, and later the People's Paper, and Marx and Engels wrote for that paper too, those papers too. The tension that existed between Ernest Jones and Marx and Engels was because Jones tended to see important in some way to have this alliance with the radical bourgeoisie, the radical members of parliament who would have supported free trade, for example. He saw as a natural ally against the aristocracy. What Marx and Engels were arguing, however, is that actually the proletarian character of the Chartist movement was the most important thing, and ceased writing for Jones's papers because of his tendency to ally himself with the radical bourgeoisie. And he argued, and in one of Marx's letters, argues that what Jones should do is actually form a party based in the factory districts. And from that point of view, it would soon be the radical bourgeoisie that came to him to ask for a compromise rather than the other way around. So Chartism, therefore, has this kind of tension at the heart of it. There is another important point, and it's you can't overstate it really in all of these writings by Marx and Engels around Chartism, that it's not just about getting people into parliament. It isn't just about getting people elected. It is about ensuring that the franchise is extended. It is about ensuring that freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom to publish are all integral parts of communist demands, but that the pressure has to come from without as well as from within. That electing members of parliament is an important tactical measure in distinction to the anarchists like Bakunin, but ultimately that pressure has to come from outside. This picture is a famous photograph of taken in 1848 of the great Chartist demonstration on Kennington Common, roughly where the Oval Cricket Ground is now. There is bits of Kennington Park, which was part of Kennington Common, that are still there. And there were 100,000 people present at the great Chartist demonstration on Kennington Common. The Chartist movement took different forms in different times. So, for example, in partly the sheer outrage at 1.25 million signatories on the Great Petition of 1839 being ignored, there was an insurrection in Newport in Wales, and a number of Chartists were killed and others imprisoned. In 1848, by the time of the Great demonstration in Kennington in London, there was a petition of 6 million signatures. 6 million signatures. It's hard to conceive of what 6 million signatures would look like on paper, but it caused more than a little disturbance among the ruling class, to the extent that they enacted. They used legislation that had been enacted under Charles II to ensure that no petition was delivered to Parliament by a deputation of more than 8 people. So originally the intention had been for the Great Chartist demonstration to deliver the petition en masse, but 100,000, again, the figures are staggering. 100,000 special constables were sworn in to control what might have happened if the Chartists had decided to march on Westminster come what may. So a special constable effectively for every single demonstrator was sworn in an effort to stop the Great Chartist demonstration marching on Westminster. And later, the petition was indeed delivered in a series of carts, accompanied by about eight Chartists, and was ignored, refused by Parliament. For what now are a series of demands which is taken for granted and actually seem rather tame, with the exception of annual parliaments to hold these people to account. So the forms taken by the forms of action taken by the Chartists included insurrection, As is well known, Marx and Engels were generally opposed to kind of adventurist type insurrections. And indeed, the Communist League broke up partly because people like August Willich, even in after the revolutions of 1848, wanted to have yet another insurrection. And Marx and Engels regarded that as counterproductive and would simply lead to more repressive legislation, would simply lead to good militants being put in prison or killed. And from that point of view, concentrated on their theoretical work in order to better inform the workers' movement in the future. Chartists also organised general strikes, and in 1842, the general strikes, which also spilled over into insurrection in places, and hence the picture of Chartists rioting at the very beginning. But this was in a spontaneous way rather than anything that was organised by the Chartists. In fact, the insurrection in Newport was not organised very well by some Chartists. And of course, the Chartists stood candidates, and Harney, for example, stood against Lord Palmerston in his Tiverton constituency and won the hustings. So imagine the situation. You have the sitting Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, at the hustings, giving his speech, and Harney getting up and giving his speech, and then a popular vote taken by show of hands, and Harney winning almost overwhelmingly, and being paraded around the town on shoulder height afterwards. However, Harney knew perfectly well that that would go to a ballot. He wouldn't be elected by popular acclaim, and of course, Lord Palmerston, by right of birth, effectively resumed his place as Prime Minister. However, Fergus O'Connor was elected, and having defeated the free trader Thomas Hobhouse. Fergus O'Connor originally came from a Protestant background, as were many of the people who took part in the United Irishmen uprising, which was one of whom was Fergus O'Connor's uncle, as I said, at a time when Protestantism and republicanism were most usually allied together in the context of Irish politics. And so the only person elected as a Chartist MP, Fergus O'Connor had been an MP before in County Cork. He was, in fact, the MP for Cork in the 1830s, 1835, I think. He was later disqualified in 1837 because his income wasn't enough to qualify as an MP. Later, as I say, he won the Nottingham seat. I would suggest having a look at Volume 6 of Marx and Engels' collected works to see the kind of fulsome appreciation, the sheer enthusiasm that Engels in particular. It was signed by Marx and Engels and someone else from the Belgian Communist Correspondence Committee and published in the Northern Star, as a fulsome appreciation, and seeing this as a first little step towards full working class representation in Parliament, as well as on the streets, as well as in mass demonstrations, as well as in presenting petitions. So I think it's pretty clear, and becomes clearer later when we look at Marx and Engels and their attitude towards the German Social Democratic Party and elections, towards their attitude towards the Parti Ouvrière in France, and their attitude towards elections, that Marx and Engels remain consistently in favour of standing candidates, but more than just standing candidates, that these candidates were part of, and only part of, a revolutionary movement in which the liberation of the working class is the act of the workers themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade. Excellent. Comrades, if you have questions or contributions, please click raise hand. That was really a good introduction to the Chartists and their efforts in standing in elections, etc. There are other areas, of course, that Marx and Engels got involved in. There's a very good book, if I could recommend, by August Nimtz on Marx and Engels and elections. I can actually get you the title. I will also put this in the chat. The Ballot, the Streets, or Both, from Marx and Engels to Lenin and the October Revolution, where he outlines a few issues around elections. And perhaps I could ask you a couple of questions on those issues. August Nimtz, for example, outlines and shows the impact of the French Revolution and especially the American Revolution on Marx and Engels and their communism. And he describes how Marx and Engels, they looked at Hegel as, their erstwhile hero, and he had zilch to say on elections and the constitutions. In fact, he was he was in favor of a constitutional monarchy, which helped them to move away from him as well towards socialist revolution. Then there's, of course, the issue, and I wonder if you know a little bit more about that. This is the impact of Marx and Engels on what they call the democratic revolution, i.e. their attitude, which wasn't quite straightforward, their attitude towards the sort of radical bourgeoisie, because at the time, obviously, the radical bourgeoisie was standing up to the old order, wanted democracy for itself mainly, but Marx and Engels did support them, and to a degree, arguing that they would be, the democratic revolution would open the way for the socialist revolution, and that led them to different attitudes at different times, where they changed their view. For example, should we support radical Democrats when they're standing, radical bourgeois Democrats, or should we put forward people from our side? And from our side, they meant, the working class, but also the small peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie, because the working class was a small minority then in society. But Marx and Engels basically didn't trust the bourgeoisie. They had a very mistrusting. They could see that they were in favor of fighting for democracy for themselves, but even there they were quite hesitant, and they failed over and over again. In 1848, for example, they made revolution, helped the revolution, and then sort of allowed a coup d'etat by the old order to take place. So do you know a little bit more about this, the changing attitude towards the liberal bourgeoisie, the radical side of the democracy? Because Marx and Engels did call themselves, or did call for, how was their phrase with the battle? We need to win the battle for democracy. And they did include sort of parts of the radical bourgeoisie in that battle.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the origins of what's often now talked about as permanent revolution. The term permanent revolution is, it's awkward. I mean, in Russian, for example, it's непрерывная революция. So it's the unbroken revolution, the revolution that moves from one phase to the other in an unbroken manner. So permanent revolution just sounds like constant mayhem, but that's not what's being talked about here. What Marx and Engels, observing the revolutions of 1848, could see that the bourgeoisie, of course, wanted the support of the proletariat in helping to overcome the restrictions placed on trade, in particular by the aristocracy, which is why you get this association, for example, in the Chartists of an alliance between free traders, people who are on the kind of liberal, radical bourgeoisie, but Marx and Engels, so an alliance between them and the proletariat. And of course, what Marx and Engels were aware of is the way in which the proletariat was effectively used to bring about the kind of radical transformation which would secure, for example, the inviolability of private property, the inviolability of the person, all the things that are absolutely necessary for capital accumulation. You don't want an absolute monarch who can simply appropriate your wealth that you've assiduously stolen from people all around the world. Yes, so the but the point about that, of course, is that once that bourgeoisie, that once the proletariat is called upon in to assist that bourgeois revolution, the proletariat itself puts forward its own demands, and that's where we start to look at the permanent revolution, непрерывная революция, the idea of an unbroken revolution. So that what had been liberal democratic demands eventually spill over into the demand for the emancipation of all humanity. And it always amazes me, Engels, who could have lost his life in the revolutions of 1848, within 2 years had published the Peasant War in Germany, to use it as an allegory for what had taken place in the bourgeois revolutions of 1848, showing how there is always another revolution, sort of in almost the capitalism comes into being almost pregnant with the possibility of socialism, and involving the proletariat in that revolution, there's always the possibility of a socialist revolution going further.
It's interesting, of course, that the Communist Manifesto was written just before the revolutionary wave of 1848, and sort of that took them a little bit by surprise, I think, although they could see something was happening. And so a few months later, Marx and Engels published the demands of communists in Germany, which are really interesting because they do go into sort of democracy and electoralism as well. And I've just looked it up again in the original German because I was quite surprised. It does say universal suffrage for all Germans, not just men, actually, which was quite unusual. So it says everybody, all Germans, yes. So it's not for foreigners, but it was quite unusual at that time, I believe, that you'd include women presumably as well. Or do you think that's just a sort of a formulation that actually means men? It's just they wrote Germans.
Well, we know that within months of the founding of the First International, there was a woman on the sort of executive of the First International. Although Marx and Engels were, of course, of their time, I don't think there's any doubt that they were fully cognizant of the importance of all citizens, and ultimately, for citizenship to mean anything, it has to be universal. Because after all, it's not as if women weren't working. Working in mines, they were working in factories everywhere, and of course, vast numbers in domestic service and everywhere else. Although it was called the International Working Men's Association, I mean, it did admit women, and later formulations in Parti Ouvrier or whatever were quite explicit in their inclusion of women in the demands.
So it doesn't, in the demands, it doesn't mention the annual elections, but I thought it's an interesting demand, isn't it? And it had a lot of discussions on the left, as you say, a lot of people on the left will say that's daft, but I mean, there's workers' militias in there. Actually, we should discuss that as well. But annual election, that's like, oh, millions, billions being spent on just PR, and one debate after the other. We'll be sick of elections, but that sort of presumes, of course, that it's like today. You have this billion-pound machinery every 5 years. It swings into action, etc., and everything else kind of stops. But annual elections, I think, is within the present system. Obviously, we would want something better down the line. But for a demand on today, it seems quite a democratic way to get around the difficulty of recalling MPs unless they've behaved in a criminal way, because you can be elected with whatever 30% of the vote locally with this electoral system. So the other 70% could always put in a petition to recall you if there was a simple recall petition, whereas this sort of an annual election would mean constantly transparency. It would mean you're constantly have to do what the electorate wants you to do, what your constituents want you to do. You're always on your toes. You can't just say, well, the next 4 or 5 years, I'll just do whatever I want and for my own career, and then we'll see what happens. So I think it's an imminently democratic demand within the confines of parliamentary democracy. What do you think about it? Are there better ways of democratizing parliament?
Well, by the time the commune had happened, of course, in a sense, that had been revised even further. So you have an almost a constant potential for recall. A deputy could be recalled at any time, and it's almost as if the commune, as the name suggests, was a kind of constant. So no representative was paid any more than the people they represented. They could be recalled at any time, not even waiting a year. So if you didn't like the way they voted in the commune, you could vote them out then and there. So in a sense, it was a radical demand put forward by the Chartists, and one which would be an advance over what we have today, which is a kind of gift to every opportunist going. But an even better one would be what eventually, of course, one could go further and say that the Soviets, as they came into being in the Soviet Union in the first years after the Russian Revolution, was a kind of direct participative democracy in every area of life. Even trains on the Trans-Siberian Express threw up their own Soviets, or workers and soldiers and sailors and everyone else would have their own Soviets and send delegates to bigger Soviets. So you would have that kind of direct participative democracy. We can't predict the form that it will take in the future. I think what we have now, though, resembles no sort of democracy at all, where people are just sent to Parliament for 4 or 5 years and accountable to absolutely nobody. And one of the great failings of Jeremy Corbyn was his refusal to have the mandatory reselection of members of Parliament. So they were at least accountable to the people who sent them to Parliament in the first place.
I mean, this is touching on something that Marx and Engels wrote, that it's obligatory to participate in election one way or another. I mean, he argued against the anarchists who thought this is all a big con. He thought it's obligatory, but he always pointed out that universal suffrage, even if everybody's allowed to vote, will not by itself do away with, I think, what he called the fundamental contradiction, i.e., you're not allowed to actually, via parliament, via elections, you're not allowed to touch, the how things are organized, the system, the private property, the means of production, etc. All of that would be untouchable, even if everybody is allowed to vote. So he was always saying, the universal suffrage, this is just a stepping stone. This will not do away with capitalism. It is important to democratize society, but I think it is a quote: universal suffrage had to be set aside by revolution or by reaction. And in the 1848, it was done away with by reaction. At the moment, obviously, we have we're in a sort of transitionary period that could go either way as well. And Engels, there's some interesting in that book by August Nim, some interesting quotes by Engels, who talks about parliamentary cretinism, which we sort of associate with Lenin, actually. But Lenin was an avid student of what Marx and Engels had to say on that issue. The idea that you solve everything through parliament, the left-wing liberals who believe that parliament is the be all and end all. So Marx and Engels, while fighting for everybody to be able to participate in elections, had no illusions that elections would change dramatically how capitalism works.
Yeah, and of course, famously, Marx talked of Parliament as an executive committee for managing the affairs of the entire bourgeoisie. It was under no illusions about what bourgeois parliaments had to offer, and of course, by the time of the Commune, it's explicit. You can't just simply take hold of the existing forms of power and wield them in the interests of the working class. That ultimately that has to be smashed and done away with, and a completely different form of democracy instituted in its place. In the meantime, why waste the possibility of putting forward a people's tribune in a bourgeois parliament? Unfortunately, I think that those kind of wannabe people's tribunes that will be standing, for example, to the left of the Labour Party, are a pretty mixed bag. If you look at the programme of the Workers' Party, or if you look at Tusk or whatever else, you're not necessarily seeing something which is calling for the ultimately the overthrow of bourgeois democracy, and its extension to direct participative democracy. They're just simply saying, what we want to be is a left Labour Party. We want to seize hold of the existing parliament and use it to bring about socialism. Expressly what Marx and Engels always argued against.
Yeah, although I mean they're interesting is that their newspaper Neue Rheinische Zeitung was also called Organ der Demokratie, organ of democracy. So we should keep in mind that they didn't just shout revolution. They did argue for democratization of existing society as a way for the working class to gain power and to train itself to become the ruling class. So they took all of these things very seriously. Okay, I'm going to open up for the audience now. Mark first. Hi.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, good talk and other bits of stuff. I mean, most of it I very much agree with. I don't want to go over it, but I think it probably is quite interesting to get to some of the nitty-gritty of what it actually meant, which has been touched on at the election times itself. So the waivers were exploited, obviously, in terms of being got on side in the 1820s and 1830s to help with the passing of the Reform Act of 1832, and they'd been very badly let down as a result of that, because most of them didn't, in fact, get the vote. There was a small number of people who did do that. The next time and following which, of course, was the passing of the absolutely hated Poor Law, which I think was essential. Hang on a second, my phone's going to turn off. 2 seconds, please. Oh dear. I think I'm going to go dead on here, so I might have to ring back. Sorry about that. I've lost the lead on it. I'll come back in. Cheers. Sorry about that. Too much talking.
No worries.
Okay, I'll come back.
Okay.
Cheers, sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, we've got Steve, please.
Thank you, Tina. Yes, I think obviously it goes back to a theme, and I would like to get onto that theme, which is the idea of a Republican communism, as it were, as opposed to anarcho-communism. That is to say, Republican communism is if you like, extreme democracy, extremely democratic in its politics. Is, if you like, its republicanism is revolutionary. And it's hostile to any kind of economism, which limits the politics of the working class to trade unionism. And essentially, it's the idea that the working class is the only real democratic class in capitalist society, and therefore the working class is the class that can potentially be the vanguard, the leader of any struggle for democracy. Now, that point about liberal democracy, in 1848, the liberal Democrats, as it were posing themselves as leaders of democracy, as the people who wanted democracy. But that was the way you would show that a sham would not by saying, oh, they're conning you, they're betraying you, which they were, but by actually being more militant, by, as it were, taking the leadership, by fighting for those rights and liberties more militantly in more revolutionary ways than the liberal Democrats who were going to run away and betray the democratic movement. And so Marx and Engels I would say, were therefore, that was the angle they took, or the angle they were developing in their politics at that time. Now, Chartism, therefore, in this context, is an extremely important movement, which is why Trotsky wrote about it as being one of the most important things. And it's why, I mean, I always like to fly a flag whenever I possibly can. But it's why in the flag that we use here, we've got the red and the green, which were two of the Chartist colours. They had a tricolour flag, and it is a connection to the French Revolution, but they had a tricolour flag that was red, green, and white. So, as you said at the beginning, Ian, that's the connection to the French Revolution was so important to early 19th century politics. And I mean, the revolution thing was not the idea that, well, what this is all about is getting MPs. It was about the struggle for democracy. It was about having a constitutional change which threatened the existing, even though the 6 demands, when you might say, looking back at it, not all that radical, really. They're more or less one apart from, you say, annual parliaments. But in its context, they threatened the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was terrified of Chartism because they saw the working class organising around it as a popular movement from below. And it was the movement for something limited that was very powerful and very threatening. And quite rightly, we mustn't forget the 7th demand of the Chartists, which was to end the Union, which you obviously referred to in talking about Fergus O'Connor and others. It was very much an anti-unionist movement. And we have to learn that lesson, by the way. And although that was about Ireland, democracy in England has to be anti-unionist. And that's another lesson we have to take from the Chartists. And then my final point, parliamentary credit. You see, I think the House of Commons, unlike the House of Lords, the House of Commons is dysfunctional and unreformable. And therefore, to continue to speak about reforming the House of Commons, as many of the people on the left do, is parliamentary cretinism, if we could put it like that. The House of Commons should be scrapped, abolished, done away with, and not by some sort of idea that's out there, but by a new parliament, a different parliament, which is actually democratic, and not the rotten and corrupt Westminster House of Commons that functions the way it does. Any study of how the House of Commons works is think it's absolutely useless as a democratic institution. And the idea that we could somehow reform it, to me, honestly, is really parliamentary cretinism. So most of it, for me, and I'll finish on this point, Tina, most of the left in England either ignore Parliament on one hand, or they then indulge in parliamentary cretinism by thinking somehow, maybe with proportional representation, it'll all turn out all right. Well, it won't, because the institution itself is fundamentally rotten and corrupted. Finish there.
Absolutely. Do you want to say anything on that, Ian?
The question of property. I think what really distinguishes Marx and Engels is their understanding of the relationship of parliamentary forms to property, and therefore simply seizing hold of Parliament isn't enough, or seizing hold of state power isn't of itself enough. It has to be linked to the abolition of private property. There has to be the common, not just the state ownership of private property, but the common ownership of private property with that direct participative democracy in control of it. So workers actually controlling their own workplaces and maybe sending delegates to regional communes or whatever form of words we use. The problem is that the form of words we use has become corrupted or is difficult. But one always has to explain oneself. But that's at the heart of it, and that's why, for example, Marx and Engels talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat. There would have to be a period in which the bourgeoisie were not allowed to participate in deciding what happens to workers, and from that point of view, and that's why there would have to be a workers' militia to make sure that a professional army doesn't seize back control and for those who've been in power for so long. So property, and without that, any kind of attempt to transform the machinery of so-called democracy will fail.
Mark is back. I'll bring you back in. Hello.
Hello, sorry about that.
No.
What I was trying to do was to put some sort of like flesh onto what was being said about how the Chartists and the working class attempted to intervene at parliamentary elections, particularly looking at Halifax, obviously, which I know a fair bit about. There was an election in 1841, and there were a series of hustings that took place. So there was like the Liberals were on the platform, a lad called Edward Prothero and Sir Charles Wood, and the crowd was a pretty massive crowd, particularly considering how few people were allowed to vote. And after speaking, they answered questions. And the disenfranchised representative was a lad called John Crawford, who was a weaver, and he got up and asked both these people their views on what were the major issues of the day, which for the weavers, they had presented to Parliament a very well-researched paper showing how weavers were becoming extremely poor. And so they asked Sir Charles Wood, had he considered looking at that research? And basically he just said no. And what he said was that the only hope of escaping poverty was the ending of the Corn Laws. But the people who were present knew exactly what this meant. It meant that yes, food might become cheaper, but that would simply be used to further push down the wages. And he also wanted to know if they would vote for the People's Charter, and they said that they wouldn't. There was really loud groans amongst the crowd, who made quite clear that they did want the People's Charter. Thomas Cliff also was in the crowd. He was quite a well-known Chartist, and he asked them if they'd vote to repeal the hated new poor law. I don't think anybody could quite understand in today's thing. There's a lot of poverty around, of course there is, but the poor law was absolutely hated and was hated forever. Obviously, the places where people were forced into were referred to as the Bastille, and there were attempts on many of the places across the north to burn them down. People probably heard of Benjamin Rushton, and he got up and spoke. And what he had to say was, in today's thing, I think was an outstanding speech, because he made reference to the cost of the permanent standing army, basically. Permanent standing army, and which meant that people would having to pay additional taxes, and were thus there before becoming exceptionally poor. The radical candidate, who was Prothero, he was asked if he'd vote against the poor law, and he was that radical that he said no. What happened next, and it probably explains why people like Ernest Jones, who became a parliamentary candidate in Halifax in 1847, was prepared to work with the Tories, because the Tory, who was called George Sweller, he declared his outright opposition to the poor law, and said that if he was elected, he would want to repeal the law. So there was large cheers for him. So I mean, it is interesting. There are, incidentally, across the north, statues which were actually put up to Tory MPs by working class people. There's one in Bolton where the MP was honoured, and it was a genuine contribution by working class people to a man who was a bit of a mathematician, and you could take to him your pay slip, and most workers didn't understand the pay slip, and they were being ripped off, and he would go through it, and he would tell them if they should be getting paid more money. Now, obviously, a lot of these Tories were aristocrats, so there was a competition between the aristocrats and the new bourgeoisie who owned the factories. And so Ernest Jones himself sought to exploit that. Jones himself stood as a candidate in Halifax in 1847 as a Chartist candidate, in fact, and he actually won 12% of the vote. The meetings that he organised were huge, absolutely massive numbers of people turned up, and that was men and that was women as well. So the people were with him, but of course they didn't have the vote. Just before I close, obviously, it was Ian made reference to him being arrested. He was arrested in 1848 for sedition, and basically the ruling class then moved comprehensively against the working class. It imprisoned many people like Ernest Jones, and it basically tortured them by the amount of work that they had to do when they were placed in prison. Many of those who did come out were unable to work thereafter, and many of those, in fact, didn't do so. It's worth noting throughout this whole period of time of Chartism that the Tory clubs which were set up across the north of England, and I would recommend a really great book called Making Angels in Marble by David Walsh, printed by Breviary Publications, who do have a bit of a history of producing good stuff. There were just as many working class people who were members of Tory clubs as they were members of the Chartist movement. So they had large sections, as we know, of the working class at all times have been incorporated into supporting the ruling class, which is something we obviously have to try and overcome. Somebody on here asked about the book, David Jenkins' book. If you just go to my webpage, type in writer Mark Metcalf and go to the workers section, right at the bottom, you can download David's book, which is the only serious book done on the 1842 general strike. There's also on there a stack of films which we've made for the Trades Council on the Chartist movement in Halifax, of which the Bread Not Bayonets one is definitely a glance at. It's 32 minutes, and it tells you the story of the heroism, particularly the women that stood up. And yeah, plenty of people were killed. Not sure how many. We're trying to get one street renamed in honor of one of the people on that particular day. Great praise. There were one or two MPs in the Houses of Commons who were for the working class. Charles Slingsby Duncan, he spoke out about what had happened in Halifax, but I think he was the only one who did it consistently. That's it. Cheers. Sorry for the embarrassing stuff earlier on. Right,
Thanks, Mark.
All right. See, and I will send that information to that email. No problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep.
Anything you want to say on that?
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed that. The only thing I wanted to add particularly was the particular cruelty in the context of Ireland of the poor law, where it was used effectively to force people off the land. Because if you had, if you owned a small potato patch or whatever else, you had to give that up before you could get any kind of poor relief whatsoever and be given some job building a road or some such. And so it played a particularly brutal role in driving people off the land.
Thanks. Satish next. It's a bit dark. Light or something.
Hello, am I unmuted or not?
You are unmuted, but it's very dark where you are.
Just give me a sec. I'll sort out the darkness.
Oh, you can speak while you.
Right.
There you go. That's better. Oh, yeah.
All right. Okay. Sorry, I don't know where I am. There I am. Right. Okay. My question is, did Marx or Engels, or both of them, ever deal with the earlier opposition, such as the Merthyr Rising the Luddites, the Rebecca riots, and things like that, in terms of how it affected working class struggle and the right to vote as it came, and even further, any other revolutionary activity of the working classes in the 19th century, i.e., earlier than Chartism.
There were lots of discussion of, I think some of the earliest ones noted by Marx and Engels were silk weavers in Silesia, who had, partly in response to the machinery that was being introduced, had caused great poverty. So yes, is the short answer. They did, but they also wrote extensively about other forms of uprising in feudal society, and that was partly the effect that was at the heart of Engels' writings on the peasant war in Germany, for example, the pointing out that the Protestant Reformation was really class struggle by other means, and that you have a increasingly disempowered a peasantry being forced off the land, the enclosure of common lands and that kind of thing, and it would often manifest itself in terms of peasant uprisings. The problem with peasant uprisings, though, is that they were usually defeated by the overwhelming force of the state, or of whether it was a local state in terms of a local baron or whatever, or the king, and the peasantry so constituted were never in a position to constitute a revolutionary class. They constituted an opposition, but one which ultimately could only end in failure. And it's not really until you get a class that could potentially take power. So you see Marx and Engels write extensively about the English Revolution of the 1640s as part of the sweeping away of the old feudal impediments to capital accumulation, and of course recognizing that there was a radical wing to it. And other Marxist historians such as Christopher Hill have taken that up and expanded on it further. So they did write extensively about other forms of uprising. I can't remember anything particularly on Luddites as such, but I think there was, just that really.
Thank you.
What I was particularly interested in is I've been looking into the Merthyr Rising and the basically the judicial murder of Richard Lewis, Dick Penderyn, and I was wondering how much that played a part in the development of Marx and Engels' views on the struggle of the working class, because you could say that the Merthyr Rising was one of the earliest examples of anti-poll tax sort of activity.
I simply don't know enough about it to say. I mean, as I understand it, it's one of the first instances of the red flag being raised, but I don't really know it. It's 1831 or something, wasn't it? So it kind of somewhat predates the Chartists, but of course, I think it's part of that earlier history of people being forced out of work, and but it's not. Yes, so just in the same way as Silesian silk weavers or whatever else had risen up. But I don't know enough about it to comment on it.
Victor, very loud where you are.
I didn't quite catch that, Tina, but
Be loud
good
where you
evening,
are. That's why,
comrade.
probably. Okay, go on.
Out where I am. Never mind. I always like to focus on the issues and lessons of history. And having listened to this evening's talk, the main issue and lesson seems to stem from the conclusion, which I think you all actually agree with, but I agree with it too. The conclusion of the Chartists, Marx and Engels angle that the participation in elections was a good idea then. And my personal view is it's a good idea for Marxists now as well to participate in elections. However, there's some Marxists who I don't agree with. I think in particular the Socialist Workers' Party, who say that participating in elections is just reformist, whatever. We shouldn't do it. We should wait for the workers to rebel, start the revolution, and when they eventually get round to doing it, they'll hand power to us. That seems to be the view of the SWP, who were the largest far left Marxist body before the Workers' Party overtook them. And it's a view that a lot of self-styled Marxists outside of the SWP take. Now, I don't agree with their view. I want to make that absolutely clear. I think they're a largely state-sponsored, police-infiltrated organisation, and that's why they say what they say. But that is their view, and there's a lot of people who share that view. What do you think of that view? Why are so many people who consider themselves Marxists of that view and not of mine, and I suspect yours?
There's also a question in the chat, maybe what do we think about spoiling ballot papers, none of the above, as a electoral strategy, I presume. Thanks, Victor.
I think abstention in elections under certain circumstances can be extremely powerful. And one can think of all sorts of situations where massive abstention to point out the absurdity of the election, which is clearly rigged, is a perfectly justifiable tactic under certain circumstances. And this is the thing I think you find with Marx and Engels, is that they are open to a wide range of different tactics. It depends on the circumstances at the time. Do I think, I mean, I've done it in the past when there was literally no one to vote for. And I've just thought, well, I can't even be, you know, I'd rather spoil my ballot paper than not turn up. But really, I mean, what's it going to achieve? I mean, my attitude in the current election would be, given the genocide currently taking place in Palestine, I would say vote for anyone who is actively going to oppose that. Tens of thousands of lives are at stake here, if not millions. And so that for me is a crucial issue. I frankly despise the Workers' Party. I despise George Galloway for his opportunism, for his attitude towards a woman's right to choose, for his attitude towards immigration. What you see with Marx and Engels is proletarian internationalism. A worker has no country. What you see with George Galloway is the numbers game of how many people we're going to let in, and therefore a kind of a red-brown kind of politics, which speaks of nationalism, British jobs for British workers type of attitude, which doesn't sit very squarely with his supposed internationalism around Palestine. But where I'm voting, for example, in Newton Aycliffe and Spennymoor, there is the Workers' Party standing against quite clearly an NEC placeman. And so I will be voting for the Workers' Party because what's at stake is so important in terms of Gaza and whatever else. I've never agreed with the Socialist Workers' Party, even though I've known good comrades in there who are good militants under certain circumstances. And I don't see the point of throwing away something so potentially valuable in terms of what it can do for just even getting the issue raised, whatever the issue is, whether it's the health service or whether it's Palestine or whatever else. So, yeah, no.
What strikes me is that an active approach is always the best, especially in a period where we are so, where there's such a poverty of left principled candidates. Like, go out and ask your candidates about their attitude, to arms sales to Israel, for example. Publish those views, say you're going to put it in a local paper, put it in a left-wing paper, etc. Make it public and put a bit of pressure on them. These are people who live through, be elected by opinion from below. So it's a really good idea to put some pressure on them. John McDonnell, for example, people like that who pretend or who have been left in the past and then perhaps forgot about it occasionally. So it'd be good to put some pressure on them. William.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm interested and always was with the Chartists. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was on this, one of your younger contributors got annoyed with me because I was being a little disparaging towards the British working class. And he told me that the British working class put a monument up in Salford as they were being opposed to slavery. Well, he was right, but it wasn't the British working class that put the monument up. It was the Irish working class that were living in Salford at the time. And then you sided with him, Tina. You said that the Chartist movement was, you were claiming the Chartist movement for the British working class, which cannot be totally done. Because first of all, Fergus O'Connor was Irish. And in the Irish were after emigrating to Britain in 1848 and 3 or 4 years previous to that and after that because of the famine. And the famine would have depopulated Ireland from 8 million to 4 million in those 5 years. Now, I'm amazed that there was a petition with 6 million people signed. Because first of all, literacy wasn't universally accepted out of in existence. And the population of Britain at the time, England, was only 12 million. So 6 million, that means every second person signed that petition. But now I'd look into that a bit further. There was one little historical mistake you made in, you had said that the Catholic emancipation took place in the 1830s. It didn't. Catholic emancipation, and by the way, it wasn't Catholic emancipation, it was the Emancipation Act. It came into being in 1829. It's called the Catholic Emancipation Act because the Catholics wanted to be called that, because they wanted to give the impression that they were the only ones that would oppressed, and they wouldn't. The Emancipation Act gave emancipation to Muslims, Jews, all of the non-established Protestant sects, including the Quakers, the Unitarians, and all people like that. Now, Fergus O'Connor was a Protestant, but he was an Anglican, and he was from the established church, so he didn't suffer any from the emancipation, or he didn't suffer from the penal laws in any shape or form. Now, the Irish would have been the backbone of the Chartist movement insofar as they were an itinerant workforce in a foreign country, and a lot of them speaking a foreign language, not English, and they were there as and they were the backbone. Now, I don't think England has a revolutionary tradition. It doesn't. It has a reformist tradition, and I think that the Chartists are probably responsible for that, because they weren't pushing for a revolution; they were pushing for reform. And the indigenous English themselves were after going from being serfs to proletariats, and only very recently in their history, before the Chartist movement was founded, they would have left the land. They would have been serfs to the Lord of the Manor, and then they would have become wage slaves in the factories when the Industrial Revolution got off the ground. The Chartist movement, the Irish played a major role in the Chartist movement, and they should be seen and they should be studied separately from the British contribution to get a full understanding of the Chartist movement. You have to understand a full understanding of how the Irish really were experienced, what they were experienced at that particular time. Other than that, I enjoyed the lectures. Thank you very much.
Ian, are the English not revolutionary?
Engels was scathing about the English working class. There's some nice quotes I found in another presentation which I gave, saying that how he expressed his exasperation with the English working class and their sense of kind of superiority, and he goes on to say, effectively, you know, the English will probably be the last to arrive at the party, but when they do, it'll be a significant contribution. So he was absolutely scathing about the impact that British imperialism had made on the English working class in particular. And as you know, William Engels was kind of second to none in his determination to see Irish independence and the importance of breaking up the fact that Britain was clearly impeding Ireland's development. And of course, you know, Manchester, Liverpool, London are all Irish cities to a large extent, and you know, the whole construction of the canal network, the railways, and everything else is well known, and it's, you know, fairly obvious, really, that the driving of the Irish off the land was one of the things that fueled the industrial revolution in Britain, and of course, you know, one sees it in terms of British attitudes towards Ireland even now. But so it's there. I mean, Engels is pretty forthright about it. But for all that, what I would say is, again, bringing back to proletarian internationalism, and I wouldn't think there's any working class that is kind of beyond redemption, as it were. I mean, ultimately, it's the United States that the world hegemon at the moment, and without, in a sense, without the US working class, a high proportion of which was also of Irish descent, without that internationalism, socialism's nothing. And the idea of socialism in one country is absurd. The idea of therefore dividing workers against one another, whether it's British or Irish or American or black or white or whatever, is no part of the vocabulary of Marx and Engels. But obviously the impact of Ireland on Chartism is enormous.
Matthew.
Yeah, and I think the point made, I don't think you should write off any working class. Obviously, all of them have their contradictions and their histories, and you know, and of course all the different elements, you know, and things obviously will change over time. And the current Irish community in the US is not particularly left wing. In fact, it constitutes the base for Biden and the right in many cases. But you know, these things occur over history, and obviously the working class we have in Britain now is quite different in terms of its origin and so on and so forth than it was even, you know, 50 or 60 years ago. But I think the basis here really is that fundamental contradiction that lies within bourgeois democracy. I mean, the thing is that the bourgeoisie is not by inclination a democratic force. I mean, it seeks obviously to dictate and exploit as a small minority the majority of people, and also to dominate them, you know, ideologically, which is critical. And the point being is it's actually taken democracy and incorporated it, you but while maintaining what exists at the moment, its own dictatorship, and particularly the machine. I mean, this is what comes out with Corbyn, is the reluctant, the extreme, reaction to the notion of Corbyn, even as people who, somebody we can criticise and whatever else, for numerous things and political terms, but clearly not trusted by the bourgeoisie in the slightest with the office of Prime Minister, which is so central to the operation of the state itself. And as you can see in terms of obviously you can see this thing between the actual function of the state machine versus the sort of democratic veneer. And it's clear also in councils, which are essentially run by the officers who essentially represent the state machine, but have to concede to the democratically elected councillors on some things, but certainly not that much from my experience of talking to councillors. They run the thing, and the councillors are something around the side. So in those terms, it's an ideological thing, part of the whole process of control. But as the point being, I think, first of all, is that obviously all of the revolutionaries, all the good ones, all the decent ones, have said, okay, well, we have to exploit that. Anything we concede, anything they concede in terms of democracy, we need to use. I mean, even rotten and inadequate franchises like in Germany, where for the SPD in the 19th century, like even in Russia, where the franchise was appalling. I mean, Lenin absolutely insisted it must be used. And rightly so, because he gave a tribune for the left to point to an alternative. And the thing is, the problem we have at the moment, of course, is the fact that none of the reformists and so on, have pointed to any alternative to what we have now. They just fiddle around the edges with it, as opposed to saying, well, no, actually, this whole thing is requiring to be replaced by a different power to the one we've got. The thing at the moment, this becomes particularly intense now, because what we're seeing, obviously, is a move by the US as world hegemon away from democracy and towards use of the possibility of dictatorship, the use of the courts as a means of running the system, via appointed crazies and all the rest of it, and actually sort of this shift away, and from any form of democracy. And also, of course, we can see, the ruling class in Europe, and with the European elections which start today, increasingly funding the far right and the fascists, as we will see here too. I think we will see that move towards that and away from against democracy. But it's that fundamental contradiction between a democratic form and the form of dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and it's actually to point that up. And the problem being, of course, is we haven't got the political forces to do that at the moment.
Yep. Matthew, Ian, do you want to say anything?
No, I don't disagree. I agree.
John, you have no camera, so you can speak now.
John? Thanks, Ian, for the lead off. Very interesting history. I think the you're talking about the political bourgeois and the compromises that the Chartists made and so on. I mean, where we are today, it wasn't that long ago that the SWP was in respect and actually supporting candidates, although they didn't actually put candidates forward themselves. Of course, Millicent also had 4 MPs at one point, and that was around Liverpool. So for me, there's a kind of link. With respect, it was about the war, and with militant Liverpool, and now we're getting MPs around, or MPs, we're getting candidates around Palestine. So any kind of left bloc that would be elected, you know, would one would hope would have a link to that movement outside, of course, because that's where the movement, both inside and outside the Labour Party and so on, you know, lies. I mean, TAS does actually point out workers' pay on a worker's wage, that kind of stuff. Nobody get any more than a worker's wage. And, you know, if people actually read their newspaper, they do, you know, call for the 200 top companies to be. So they are calling for revolution in the same way the SWP is. But I'm just thinking that in terms of now, I would have thought that, you know, we do need to build a bloc in Parliament. You have got your usual campaign group, but they're never, as individuals, they're quite good. As a group, they never seem to be able to be effective. And the demands that are made on people who are, if they ever are, elected under task, those demands would be, you know, against cuts, so on and so on. So any MP in Parliament would have to actually go, you know, actually be accountable to the task idea or manifesto, whatever. And of course, the independents too. So they don't really have what you call a task, a manifesto. So, and also proportional representation. I do think it's important to at least begin to. I mean, even though it's going to be it's not going to change the actual capitalist society. It's always the link between the working class and the movement that's supposed to be representing them. That has, you know, that does have an effect on them. And yeah, I mean, probably not the same in maybe the best way, but yeah, I'm just pointing that out really. Yeah. Oh, the other thing was that you say that we need, you know, a real Marxist party, and in fact, this group will eventually at one point be looking at setting that up. So, and we've also now seen the Socialist appeal come out with an actual Communist party. And the question is really, isn't it, is that what kind of appeal is a Marxist, Leninist, or just Marxist party actually going to have in terms, and actually, you know, talk about taking capitalism out and how to do it. I haven't read the Socialist appeal as yet, so I don't know what exactly they're, you know, what they're saying. But I know this group is looking to do it. I know that talking about socialism from a Marxist perspective, they're also looking to do it. But it does seem to me that, yeah, we have to test the appeal of a real revolutionary Marxist party. I agree with that. Yeah, so let's see what happens.
Quite a few questions there, John. Okay, you pick and choose which ones you want to answer.
I'm not here to have a go at one or other party particularly, but of course I have a view. and there's not necessarily any. I mean, with Militant, for example, during the poll tax, I mean, I think the whole idea of not paying the poll tax was a very good idea, and it worked. I think there are problems with municipal socialism. I think the idea that you could just take control of a city council and put forward kind of intermediate demands or whatever, and then somehow that will help bring the whole deck of cards come crashing down was plainly false. When you end up having to lay off your own workers to balance the budget because they've eventually got you over a barrel, it doesn't look good. And also, I mean, even things around transitional demands like the nationalisation of the top 200 companies or whatever. On the face of it, as a radicalism to it, what concerns me about it is the idea that this is state socialism. This is the state deciding, once again, the idea that you could seize control of the state and use that to bring about socialism. Seems to me in stark contrast with Marx talking about the liberation of the working classes, the act of the workers themselves. I'm in favour of a party. I'm absolutely in favour of a mass Marxist party. At the moment, it doesn't exist, and the fact that it doesn't exist is a reflection of the fact that proletariat has yet to come into being as a revolutionary force. I have good working relations with the local Revolutionary Communist Party. They're good comrades. They're nice people to talk to. I've enjoyed their company, but I sadly think that they'll go the same way as the Socialist Workers' Party. It will be an organisation in which, there'd be precious little democracy. I think, even the decision to launch the Revolutionary Communist Party from socialist appeal was something that was sprung upon the membership at their congress. Well, it wasn't even a congress. It was their sort of annual kind of summer school type of thing. It was, so it was a decision taken at the top and handed down in the style of Tony Cliff, in the style of Jerry Healy, and all the rest of them. And unfortunately, I think what then happens is you get lots of really good comrades who end up being newspaper selling fodder with very little to say about the direction that party will take. And then ultimately they drift away, they split, they do whatever else. They don't allow factions. I mean, I've said, for example, just on a personal capacity, if they allowed factions, I would join the Revolutionary Communist Party tomorrow. But I would want the right to be able to campaign to change the party line in some way, and that should be an open process. And I think without that, I mean, what's often overlooked is that there were factions in the Bolshevik, even within the Bolsheviks. I'm not talking about the faction of the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks. I'm talking about even within the Bolsheviks, there were factions right up until 1921, and it was the suppression of factions that actually was a measure of the fact that the Russian Revolution was defeated. It was a sign of weakness, not strength, to ban factions. And I think, unfortunately, in a way, I would prefer to vote for Tusk than the Workers' Party. But what in the end are Tusk standing for except Labour Party 2.0? I don't want another Labour Party. I mean, out there are literally tens of thousands of people who have been members of Marxist parties of one sort or another. Tens of thousands over the years have gone through them. Typically, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' Revolutionary Party. Now, the RCP 2.0, when it was in the hands of Frank Fruerdi. All these people have been through Marxist parties of one sort or other. At least some of them remain Marxists, notwithstanding. And of course, 500,000 people joined the Labour Party because of Corbyn, because the vague possibility that someone might actually democratise the Labour Party, and unfortunately, it's just set things up to fail. And now what you've got is Tusk standing against the Workers' Party and so on. So you more fragmentation. I don't doubt for a moment there will be some realignment after the election on the right as well as the left. And it would be interesting to see what the Reform Party does in terms of whether it will just act as a ginger group on the Tory party or whether it will actually form a political force to the right of the Tories. I mean, I seem to recall that one of the reasons why the British National Party faded into insignificance was because at least some of their policies were taken over by the Tory party. But there's nothing unusual about that. I'm of an age old enough to remember, the 1972 general election, when repatriation of Commonwealth British citizens, and they were British citizens, they weren't immigrants, was actually part of the Tory party manifesto. And local Tory parties expressed it in more vile racist terminology than that. So despite all of that, I remain enormously optimistic. Not least of which because there will be a fundamental realignment after the election. What form it takes, we can't tell. But it's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to happen just because we sit and wait for it. It's not just going to happen because of the way capitalism is declining. The very fact that you have an international movement of literally millions of people in support of the people of Palestine doesn't mean that that's going to become a world movement for socialism, but it does mean a world movement is at least possible.
And it's not going to happen by us saying it needs to happen, unfortunately. We're there when things move, but unless the working class moves, there's not going to be a real communist party in the sense of it, Marxist party. Okay, Steve wants a small second bite of the cherry. I know what he's going to say. He's going to defend the revolutionary credentials of the English working class.
Of course, Tina knows what I'm going to say. But I want to agree, first of all, with William O'Brien, because obviously he made a point, and I think it's true. I mean, one could think that the Chartist movement was really the Irish in England. I mean, obviously that's an exaggeration, but there's a certain truth in that, which William highlights. So I do agree with him on that. And that's why this seventh demand against the union was such an important, underestimated but important demand within Chartism. And that's why Marx took all that out question and was an anti-unionist himself, and took a position, first of all, for a federal relationship between Ireland, and then he said, well, first of all, we'll end the union. If we end the union, maybe federalism will work. And that's the position he was developing. But I wanted to jump in because I then wanted to rebel against what William said, because he said there's no revolutionary tradition in England, and of course there was, and that was the English Revolution itself, which killed massive battles and massive struggles that killed a massive portion of the large number of the population were killed in England. And there was a revolutionary movement. And so, you know, and I always like to do colours. I think colours are important, by the way. I mean, the green in these colours here, by the way, the green for the Chartists, I said the Chartists, green and red, but the green is the Levellers. So you could never, if you remember the colours, you could never forget that. So George Galloway's got red, white and blue. That's his colours. And here we've got red, green, and we've got violet. So there's a different colour. So it's a battle of colours. So you've got George Galloway's red, white and blue, and you've got what we want to say. But the Levellers in 1649, the Levellers mutinied against going to Ireland. They were three of them were shot and they were suppressed. And so the nature of the English people is shaped by living through a massive counter-revolution after that destroyed all aspirations. And the English that we got eventually after 1688 were the Anglo-British. And the Anglo-British was an imperialistic idea, you know. So if we talk about the English working class, we're actually the Anglo-British working class. And we have to smash that idea of Britain and what it represents in terms of its history and imperialism, and go back to the revolutionary tradition of the English people that goes back to 1649, when they established the Commonwealth, right? And to learn from that in our tradition. Mass politics has to be about mass democratic politics. It's what all these sects that are in a corner fighting amongst themselves because they're not really addressing the mass politics that the people that they need to be if you're going to engage with a large number of people. Corbyn could do that, but he did it in the wrong way. You know, and we can't counterpose that tiny little sect with all the different things. That's not going to work either. Mass politics means addressing the question of bourgeois democracy in England today. And George Galloway is doing that in one way with his red, white and blue. And we're doing it in another way with the red, green and violet, which actually is the democratic tradition in England.
Or just the red flag, Steve.
Well, it's got red in it. It's got red in it, but the red flag is a world flag. It's the flag of world communism. But it can't be used to avoid the struggle in different countries and different historical traditions and different levels of development of the working class. So the Festival of Nations, Ian, thank you very much. I'll just end on this point. The Festival of Nations, I didn't know about that thing. I just looked it up now and it's really kind of useful. And thank you for finding that and bringing it to our attention because I'm going to look at it later. So that was really good. Festival of Nations, what a great idea. England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. That's what we need, a great big democratic festival.
Thanks, Steve. We've got a few more people with their hand up, but it's getting really close to the end now. I suggest we leave it at this and perhaps try and sum it up a little bit. Ian, from your perspective, because these comrades have spoken before. Sorry, I should say that if you hadn't spoken, I would bring you back in. But from your perspective, what can we learn? What's the key thing that we can learn from Marx and Engels, perhaps beyond, or perhaps that is the main thing, that, you know, at different times, in different circumstances, they proposed different things. They were for the unification of Germany, for example, but on the other hand, they were for breaking up some states, perhaps for democratic demands and to give, you know, the self-determination, etc. In terms of electoral politics, what do you think our key takeaway is from Marx and Engels and the Chartists?
Well, as you pointed out, I mean, there are tactical questions, but there are important areas of principle. And I think without that, what you end up with is making the same mistakes again and again and again, just as the Labour Party has through its entire history been opposed to socialism. That's the important thing to remember about. It has been consistently always in favour of British imperialism and against the possibility of an internationalism. So there are areas of principle, I think, that just have to be central to any kind of potentially Marxist party. And the question of imperialism is, of course, at the heart of it. You know, what the genocide we observe on a nightly basis is, okay, the United States is the world hegemon and we are its junior partner, aiding and abetting, just in the same way that Germany is, just the same way as other countries are. That NATO effectively is currently engaged in a war against Russia that will ultimately be the way of just simply paving the way for war with China, and that we're all going to pay for it, some with our lives, some merely with our standards of living, and so on. No political economic formation in history remains the same, remains unchanged. It will change. And if anyone had told me when I was a member of the YCL at 13 that eventually the Soviet Union would collapse, I wouldn't have believed them. And in the 1980s, it was still difficult to kind of convince people that the Soviet Union was not socialist or whatever. Now, I mean, the changes that we've seen have been absolutely extraordinary, just in my short lifetime. So what's likely to come is even greater. It doesn't mean to say that revolution is just around the corner, which is the sort of thing you'll get from the Revolutionary Communist Party. That, you know, what may well happen is a period of awful reaction, and we'll have to see what happens in terms of of the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. I'm always in favour of a no-state solution. I'm always in favour of the red flag rather than some tricolour or other. I think we always have to remember that Marx and Engels at no point were putting forward state solutions. Yes, they argued for example, the breakup of the British Empire, or they argued very much against the Russian Empire because it was the gendarme of Europe, a force for reaction. But that doesn't mean to say there is a national solution, and without an internationalist solution, we're lost. We're lost before we start. If a country the size of a fifth of the land surface of the world can't form socialism in one country, what chance has got even a United States of a socialist United States of Europe? A useful little slogan though it might be. One of the things that is striking about Lenin, and I don't regard myself as a Leninist, but as a sort of critical admirer of so much of one of the greatest revolutionaries that's ever lived, is that he did his homework. He sat down and wrote the development of capitalism in Russia before, and that's early on. And what we see quite often is a lack of scholarship on the part of people on the left. And I think, and I certainly am not interested in starting another party. For what? But what I am interested in doing, and what I think why Marx is and can do, is those hard yards. Because there's lots of people who don't even read Marx today, don't read Lenin, don't read Engels even. So, by the way, just as an aside to William, my reference for 6 million signatures came from the National Archive. They don't claim to have, but the National Archive states that the Chartists claimed that they had 6 million signatures. So, in the election, obviously we've got to get the Tories out. Vote for overtly socialist candidates. Vote Labour if you have to, especially if it's a decent candidate like Zara Sultana or whoever. But question all of them and vote critically and without any illusions about any of them.
Yep, sums it up. Thank you, Ian. This is not an election where we are spoiled for choice, even in constituencies where there's independents standing against Tusk, against Workers' Party. That's not being spoiled for choice. That's actually an expression of weakness of the left, and it's it's very unfortunate these things happen. And a united left would be in a much better position and could probably inspire more people to vote left, perhaps at the next elections. It's going to be up to us to shape whatever comes out of the elections and whatever happens afterwards. Next week, we're taking a look at the Labour Party. Is it still a bourgeois workers' party, as Lenin called it? Has it changed so much now that there is no working class pole left? What about the unions? They're still affiliated. Does that count? Should we ask them to be disaffiliating? Can we vote Labour? Where? How? When? We're going to have a discussion on that next week, and hope to see many of you then. Thank you very much, Ian. Great discussion tonight. Bye-bye, comrades.